See ya.
Can be very valuable thing. They're only about
5 of these. Well, that's the nicest bound galley I've seen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's Jim, are you going to prefer to speak from the podium or?
Yeah. How are we going to do this?
No, you.
Okay.
I was just asking how he's going to, if he were to speak from the podium, and he will do that. And you can do whichever you want. It gives the camera people a little different focus, I guess.
Sure.
You want us both to speak in the same area or separately? Like this microphone section, microphone.
Well, good afternoon. Let me welcome all of you to our book launch for James Reston's book, Dogs of God. I'm Sam Wells, the Associate Director of the Center, and very pleased to host this event. Jim Reston is a senior scholar here at the Center and has been working on probably one of the broader topics of anyone who is presently here. He is, as you would know from the dust jacket of his book, the author of 13 books, 3 plays, numerous articles in national magazines, many interviews. The last 3 books, Galileo, A Life, The Last Apocalypse, and Warriors of God, have been translated into 10 foreign languages and have appeared, excerpts have appeared in many magazines. It's been reviewed widely. The current book was, I gather, reviewed today in USA Today. It was reviewed slightly prematurely in the Washington Post a week or so ago. Today is, I believe, the publication date, which happens to be on the traditional Columbus Day. And Jim may have something to say about that. James Reston has been a fellow at the American Academy in Rome, a scholar in residence at the Library of Congress, and a fellow of the Wilson Center, and currently a senior scholar at the Center. He attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he earned a degree in philosophy. After some time in the Army and working for the Secretary of the Interior, he was a lecturer in creative writing at the University of North Carolina for a decade, starting in 1971. He always looks for big topics. He's got one here, and it's our pleasure to listen to him describe some of the highlights of the book. Jim?
Yes. As Sam said, this is the official publication date of Dogs of God, and that is always a time for an author to dream, about all the glowing reviews that are to come, and it's still before the invitation from Oprah and before the appearance on bestseller lists. In short, before reality really sets in. Dogs of God, I have said in the introduction, or maybe it's in the afterword, is the 4th book of a quartet. And that quartet is Galileo, The Last Apocalypse, that was about the year 1000, 1,000 years before the 2000 millennium that we experienced. And then Warriors of God, and finally Dogs of God. half seriously, I have said this is my foray into the dark corners of the Roman Catholic history. It's true enough that I have a deep and abiding interest in the relationship between religion and society, in the uses and abuses of religion for political purposes by leaders of all sorts. I suppose it began for me with the story, the awful story of the Reverend Jim Jones in the jungles of Guyana, but it moved on to the popes in Rome and to Catholic monarchs and to presidents of the United States. Because the messianic impulse of leaders goes far back in time. Leaders who speak to God and who think God speaks to them. Indeed, in this story, we find that King Ferdinand, in the year 1516, when he was on his deathbed, said, "I can't die now because I was told that I would capture Jerusalem after I captured Granada in a final successful Holy Crusade. And I haven't done it yet, and yet God told me that I would do that." The choice of a subject for an author like myself is a daunting one. It's more than an abstract theme like the relationship of religion and society. For me, it really begins with a literary impulse. Is it a good story? Are the characters good? Is it an important story? And does it have any relevance to the current day? If it does not, it would be dead facts. So after hard slogging in places like the Hispanic reading room, the further question arises, can the story be told well, so that though absolutely accurate, that it will read like a novel? Or is it simply stringing together these dead facts in dead history? My principle has always come from an essay that Virginia Woolf wrote years ago called The Art of Biography. And in that essay, she talked about creative facts, that creative facts were central to the great art of biography. And by that, she meant facts that elucidate character. I believe that you can do that for events as well as for personalities, that there are creative facts that go to the essence of events. And so I look for sets of facts that can be put together in historical scenes. And so that the way I do history is not stringing together an endless set of facts, but in linking richly realized historical scenes. So these books, these four here, are not history in the traditional sense, but an effort for accurate historical literature. Now they have common elements. They have the epic characters, Saladin, Urban VIII, Richard the Lionheart, Gerbert of Aurillac, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Saladin, and now in Dogs of God, Ferdinand and Isabella, and Torquemada, and Columbus, and Boabdil the Unfortunate, and Isaac Bravanel. And once again, I have sought to humanize these characters, to knock the barnacles off, and to change the metaphor, to instill them with life, blood, and with flesh. These books, particularly the last three, also have in common the clash between East and West, between Islam and Christianity, holy war and jihad, Europe and the Arab world. And additionally, they have in common turning points in history, great turning points in history. Galileo and the telescope. Some could argue that the realization of a dynamic universe was the dividing line between ancient and modern history. Crusades then in the 13th century and now. 1492, a turning point not only in American history, but in world history and Jewish history and Arab history. And they all have relevance to the modern day. The Galileo story reflects the Galilean experience that we now are having with the glorious discoveries of the Hubble Space Telescope, and also to these profound bioethical issues that the new millennium will now face. With the millennium, we addressed for the first time the question of apocalypse. With Crusade, I had no idea, no foggiest idea how relevant that would be. And then came the apocalypse of 9/11, and on September the 16th, 5 days later, Bush proclaimed his crusade. And this was the president's greatest gift to Osama bin Laden, because it allowed bin Laden to define the terms of the conflict as a Western crusade versus an Eastern jihad. It allowed him, especially as the events rolled out with the invasion, to cast the Arabs as victims rather than the aggressors, and to cast Americans as the aggressors rather than the victims. And in all of this, it tapped into a historical consciousness of the Arab world, a region that for 800 years has been attacked and occupied and exploited and denigrated and humiliated by Western powers. And so tapping into this historical consciousness was very helpful in the propagation of a fanatic agenda. The Third Crusade itself was a metaphor for the Arab world, that they seem endlessly to be waiting for Saladin. And it brought forth this concept of jihad, this fifth pillar of the Islamic faith, in which every Islamic believer is required by his belief to engage in jihad when two essential conditions are met: the occupation of Arab lands and an attack on Islam. And this article of faith, this pillar of Islam, will never go away, regardless of the ebbs and flows of American military action. In 2002, in January, the New York Times reported that Warriors of God was one of the two books that was being suggested by Karl Rove to President Bush to read, so he really would understand what was going on in the Middle East. And said the New York Times, he was a bit confused by Saladin at first, but after he got into it, he enjoyed it. He enjoyed it. Did he bring away from it what history tells us, that Western crusades in the Arab world always fail? And did it occur to him, the old shibboleth of Santayana, that those who ignore history are condemned to repeat it? Now comes Dogs of God, which I think has relevance and resonance for the tale that I told in the Third Crusade. It certainly has the epic characters, Ferdinand and Isabella, Columbus, Torquemada, and I have tried as best I can to humanize them. In the Columbus case, I am not dealing with the voyage across the ocean blue, except only tangentially, but rather how this remarkable man navigated with great skill and patience through the treacherous political waters of Spain for 8 years before he was finally authorized to sail. And in the environment of holy war, and in the environment of Inquisition, where Jews and secret Jews were being driven out in an effort to purify Spain of infidelity, of the infidels. And I think it will come as a surprise to American readers how the Columbus voyage is bound up with the Spanish Inquisition, how it's bound up with a holy war against the Muslims of southern Spain, and that the voyage could only have been launched, or that the voyage was launched from occupied, defeated Muslim lands. So in this story, Jews and Muslims meet the same fate. In both, their religion is basically exterminated from Iberia. In this story, we see the evolution of Holocaust thinking, in which secret Jews in a collective effort are ferreted out in the Inquisition, and professing Jews, 120,000 of them, are expelled from Spain. Again, something that Jews never forget. Where then is the relevance of 1492 and this story to the current day? Well, you will see that in the introduction here, after the horrendous Madrid bombings of March of last year, that the Al-Qaeda spokesman, in taking credit, if that's the word, for the bombings, said that 1492 is not that long ago. This would seem to be a ridiculous statement to most Americans, and yet it's important for us to understand how long the memory is in the Arab world, because again, this taps into the historical consciousness that 1492 represents a defeat and a humiliation. It represents the occupation of Muslim lands and the extermination of Islam in Spain. But it also represents the end of a great dream, a great 800-year-old dream of the glorious Islamic Caliphate of Granada, the 800 years of magnificent art and architecture, of literature, its magnificent court, its science. It was the moment at which Islam was ascendant in Europe, and when the Christian northern part of Europe was barbaric by comparison. So when we read, as we did in the newspaper last week, that bin Laden's number 2, whatever his name is, said to his thug in Iraq, Zarqawi, that we really have to have a kind of PR offensive now. We have to stop this killing of civilians, and we have to have no more televised beheadings. He said, we're going to lay out our master plan here, and it begins with America being driven out of Iraq. But after that, it will involve the establishment in the Middle East of a caliphate once again, a glorious Islamic caliphate. How many Americans understand what the word caliphate means? And then the third and last step will be the attack on Israel. So in using this, the Al-Qaeda number 2 is invoking an historical model. He is tapping into historical memory. He is using historical longings, and this is powerful recruitment. And it's important that we as a nation here pay attention to the power of these historical longings. Additionally, the relevance of this to the current day has to do with the vulnerability of the Spanish Peninsula to terrorism, its proximity to the Islamic North Africa. Muslims certainly remember that it was an invasion of Spain in the 8th century by Islamic forces that established the Islamic hold on all of Spain and into France. So that Spain is the first and easiest entry point for terrorists, and this has a lot to do with Spanish politics at the moment. But to me, most interesting of all is the vulnerability that Spain has because of the dream of a new Granada. Again, the establishment of a glorious Western Spanish caliphate in which the glories of Granada and the Alhambra once again could be reestablished. And so it's no mystery why, in the last 20 or 30 years, Spanish authorities have done quite a lot to suppress and to discourage the establishment of Islam in southern Spain. We know also from this story the relationship between religion and political power when it's taken to its absolute extreme. And we know also from this story what I discussed yesterday in USA Today, the question of where Columbus should appropriately stand in American culture in the new millennium. So I hope you will read this book. It's a crackling good story. I hope it will make you think. I hope you will learn something new from it. But ultimately, dare I say it, I hope you'll enjoy it.
Thanks, Jim. Commenting on the book, we're pleased to have Dr. Everett Larson, who is head of the Hispanic Reading Room and of the Hispanic Division's reference section at the Library of Congress. He's been working at the Library of Congress for a number of years, since 1974, in fact. He earned a B.S. in Arabic languages and literature from Georgetown, a Ph.D. in Romance and Semitic Studies from Catholic University, and a Master's in Library Science from the University of Maryland. He has been very active in the American Library Association, the Society of American Archivists, and the Modern Language Association. He was national president of the Society of Federal Linguists, and he's been, I'm sure, a tremendous help to researchers over the decades in the Hispanic Division. Everett, good to welcome you here.
It's my pleasure to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars as a librarian. It is also a pleasure to be able to see the fruits of the labor of one of our readers. And to answer the question that we just heard, is it a good story? Is it important to tell? Does it have relevance for today? James Reston has provided a most readable story of the events leading up to that poignant year of 1492. Of course, he talks about the period of time of about 1449 to about 1493, but it accumulates in that poignant year. As you read his book, you're struck by the complicated political situation of opposing rulers, separate kingdoms, civil strife, religious turmoil, all of this that leads up to the financing of Columbus's project and that part of Western Hemisphere history that we know. He weaves an intriguing fabric, he himself calls it a tapestry, of how the merger of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon provided the means to conquer the remaining Islamic portions of Al-Andalus. But this could not have taken place without the resolution of religious conflict, and herein lies the story of Spain. This book is not a dull history replete with facts and dates, but rather, as he mentioned, it's a skillful weaving of those historical markers with philosophical and religious feelings of the time presented as he states himself in the book. And I quote, "It has been said in retrospect that the land of Ferdinand and Isabella," I'd prefer if he would have said lands, that the land of Ferdinand and Isabella was in the throes of transition between Middle Ages and the Renaissance, that the religious crisis over the Inquisition moved the nation into a modern age. If the Inquisition inspired terror, it was accompanied in intellectual circles by a great sense of personal liberty. Instead of the peon's dismal short existence as part of a community of sufferers, the individual could determine or at least influence his own fate. Perhaps the title of the book, Dogs of God, doesn't carry the terror inherent that you'd find if it were called The Hounds of God, where the pursuit by others is more appropriate of the Inquisition. But I'm just quibbling. Reston is not writing a history of the Inquisition, but of the consolidation of Spain, and he presents the religious tensions controlled by fear on all sides as merely a contributing factor to the cataclysmic events that symbolize 1492. He reminds us that what was playing out in Spain had international consequences, from the Vatican and the Borgia Pope to Columbus's discovery of Cuba, and these things still affect us today. He quotes from the leader of Al-Qaeda. "You know, the Spanish crusade against the Muslims and the expulsion from Al-Andalus were not so long ago." I believe Osama refers to 1492, but his history may be a bit faulty. The expulsion of the Jews took place in 1492, while the last Muslim kingdom did fall in 1492. The Muslims were not expelled until Philip III ended it all in 1609. I realize that historians have developed a specific vocabulary to discuss the peoples living in Spain. And Reston confuses a few terms, but they're minor. On page 5, we have Mozárabes, which were Christians, not Muslims, who had accepted Arab mannerisms and language. Perhaps Reston meant to say Mudéjars, who were Muslims living under a Christian ruler. And he does mention this later on in the book. But the Mudéjars had another special aspect not mentioned in the book. As an enticement to become a Mudéjar was a vassal of the king, and hence you were protected by the king. After 1502, this distinction was lost when Isabella decided, let's convert them all. And the Mudéjars were then pejoratively called Moriscos. The term Mudéjar continues today as an architectural term. But these are minor points. Reston's contribution is in the fabric he has presented to us. Read it. But like a good storyteller, he presents snippets, pulling the reader in. And sometimes, though I could see the result, I would have liked to know more of the story. For example, the 3 daughters of Muhammad IX were supposedly guarded in a famous prison to protect their virtue. But the king missed his daughters, and so he sent for them. On the way to the Alhambra, their escort happened upon 3 Christian soldiers and pounced on them. But the Christians turned out to be better lovers than fighters. What happened next? He doesn't tell me. He leaves me hanging. He leaves it up to my imagination. In sum, he brings together literature, folklore, history, and perceptions in his Dogs of God. I recommend it to you as both an enjoyable and a prescient understanding of how Spain came to be.
Thank you very much, Everett. We have a few minutes for questions, comments from the audience, and we will, at the conclusion of our session, have an opportunity for you to purchase books and have a reception across the corridor in the center's boardroom. If you would wait after you're recognized until we get a microphone to you, that will facilitate your question being recorded. Stephen Schur here.
French historians dealing with a comparable incident, the revocation of the Edict de Nantes, many but not all have said that France was economically impoverished by the expulsion of the Huguenots. So my question is it possible to imagine an alternate Spanish history where the Jews and Muslims are not expelled, and would Spain have been more prosperous economically and intellectually as a result?
Well, of course, that's a matter of speculation. It's not something that yet I have studied, but which I actually plan to do in the coming couple of years, because I'm very interested in what happened to the Moors and to the Jews when they left Spain. And Dr. Larson, if I might just say that the final expulsion of the Moors may have taken place in 1609, but the Moors are actually faced with the same expulsion order or the same expulsion choice that the Jews face much earlier, in fact, I think at the beginning of the 16th century, when you have Cardinal Jimenez as the Grand Inquisitor. It may not have been completed, that whole process, until much later, but it is the broken promise of Ferdinand and Isabella that they will tolerate Islam in Granada. And of course, they don't tolerate it at all. They give them about 8 or 9 years of a honeymoon, and then they get the same stiff choice that the Jews had. At any rate, I think it's obvious, just on the sort of the facts and the logic of the thing, that the Jews certainly were contributed richly to Spanish culture throughout the entire existence of Spain, but certainly in the centuries that we're talking about here, so as to have lost that culturally, but also financially immediately. And one of the points that I make in the USA Today article yesterday is that I think it's little understood in this country that when the Jews were expelled from Spain, they were allowed to take a very pittance of their wealth, and the rest of that wealth went into the coffers of the kingdom, and those funds were used to support and finance Columbus's second voyage, so that the nexus and the relationship between the expulsion of the Jews and Columbus's subsequent ventures is certainly well established. Similarly, one only has to go on holiday to Granada or to Seville to see the glories of the Islamic culture that was developed there over those 800 years, and to have lost that, and in effect to attempt to purify that whole land of Islam, of all of the glories of that culture and of Judaism and all of the important things that it contributed, was a terrible loss to Spain. Those Jews are spread throughout the Mediterranean. The center of gravity for Islam moves from Granada east to Istanbul, and both the Jews and the expelled Moors from Spain contributed mightily to the rise of the Ottoman Empire. So all I can say is that on the basis of speculation and logic, Spain certainly suffered greatly by those horrendous decisions.
Would you like to add something?
I think that it's quite true that if the Jews would have stayed, it may have contributed. If indeed you would have kept the peoples there, you would not have been able to achieve the solidarity which the Catholic kings were trying to achieve. History would have been quite a bit different and perhaps a lot more gentler. In 1502, Queen Isabella comes out with her Pragmatica, which says you convert or you leave Castile. So a lot of them went over to Aragon, and they stayed in Aragon, but the Muslims. But then, of course, there are those who stayed. I once visited the small town of Palencia, north of Valladolid in Spain, and walked into a bar and asked to see the synagogue. And they were surprised that I knew about it, but they took me down into the basement. And there was an underground synagogue, which had tunnels in the walls. The tunnels had long since filled in, but the people had come to this location for Shabbat services. And then one supposes on Sunday, when the priest showed up, they all went off to church. So some of them did stay. And those who went to Salonika, those who went to Rome, built up a situation where they kept commerce. And so, in essence, there was trade among these areas. Silverman and Armistead had been able to show that there was even transformation of literature that went back and forth. And plays by Lope de Vega appeared in Salonika 40 years afterwards. So who's to say what would have happened? Would it have been better or worse?
Could you identify yourself, please?
Abraham Avidor. In addition to the Muslim-Christian conflict in the Iberian Peninsula, there was also the Solomon the Great. The Turks attempted to invade Europe from the other side, and they reached as far as Vienna in the 16th century. Could you please comment on that Muslim effort to conquer Europe, and also on the role of the Jews that were already there as they escaped from Spain to Turkey and apparently got a more tolerant treatment there?
I don't know a lot about that yet, but if you come back and ask me this question in another year, I should know a lot more about it. You're absolutely right that with Suleiman the Magnificent, he moves north from what is already the Ottoman Empire and the Muslim lands extended as far as Belgrade, and he moves beyond Belgrade through Hungary and wins a great battle at a place called Mohacs, and from there moves to the gates of Vienna, where he is stopped. So that so I think the year is 1527. The northern push of Islam goes to the very gates of Vienna, and had there not been such a stout defense of Vienna, he would have moved on to the Rhine, because it was Suleiman the Magnificent's vision that Islam would go to Cologne, the holy city to Christians of Cologne, and that would be the northern boundary of Islam in Europe. So that you have Islam in the 8th century went as far as Poitiers in France as its northern terminus, and in the 16th century you have it as far as Vienna and beyond. It's always been of interest to me that in the Quran it is stated that Allah does not like aggressors. And yet there is certainly plenty in Islamic history that where Islamic forces have been the aggressors, have been the military aggressors. And this is to be contrasted with the concept of jihad, which has become so muddled in our current situation now, where jihad, it is in its essence a defensive concept.
Well, we're moving a little ways away from the book. Come to the Library of Congress. We've got lots of books on this. And if you read German, you can go to the Weimar edition of Luther's works, and you can see Martin Luther wrote a preface to a German translation of the Koran to the town fathers of Basel, Switzerland, telling them why you should translate the Koran and why you should read it.
Let's make an appointment for next week for that, Dr. Larson.
Michael Silliman.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciated both presentations, the presentation and the commentary anyway. A couple of points. One is concerning jihad. The first point is about this is that you mentioned that the two conditions, one of them is occupation of Arab lands. I think you meant Muslim lands because Islam is different from Arab. The other thing is that I think it's important always, when talking about jihad, it is important for Muslims anyway. I'm not, but it is important for Muslims to remember and remind others that the greater jihad is the struggle within oneself. And this is the lesser jihad, that is to protect Islamic lands. The other point is concerning bin Laden and people like him that want to avenge, whether it is 1492 or other attacks on Islam. I think that Al-Andalus, Spain, holds a very special part to Arabs in particular, but maybe Muslims in general, in that it was the great time of tolerance, and that all religious groups, especially certainly the three monotheistic religions, lived together in peace and also in glory. And that is something that is fairly widespread among intellectuals in literati, in the Arab world especially. And it may be worth mentioning as a counterpart to the other.
Well, I certainly take your point entirely about the attack on Islamic lands, not Arab lands. This is certainly true. As to tolerance, I think this is a very interesting question, because sometimes without people really knowing the history, they think of certain portions of Spanish history as being the high point of tolerance between the three great religions. And it is certainly true that was the case in the 13th century with Alfonso XI in particular, known as the Learned, who, as a Christian king, greatly admired the glories of the Islamic South and really aspired in Christian culture to compete with that, to bolster Christian, because it should be as great as the Islamic culture of the South was. And this stands out as a kind of model for multi-ethnic and multicultural society, a very relevant theme, I would say, to today. But it turns very sour in Spain 100 years later. And how did this happen? This is something that I don't really address in the book, and I don't really have an answer for. But here you have these extraordinary contrasts between this glorious model of multi-ethnic tolerance, and this extraordinary model another 100 years later, where the discrimination and bias and prejudice reaches an extreme that perhaps we've never seen any other time in history.
That's fine.
Will Amatruda. I have seen novelistic accounts of how strong and sustained the Moorish resistance was in the 15th century. But from a geostrategic point of view, weren't the Muslims of Al-Andalus really doomed when Cordoba and Seville fell nearly 300 years earlier?
Well, it's a long process. The so-called Spanish reconquest of Spain is a long process of 500 years, but it is certainly true that by the 13th century it's shrunk to a mere shadow of its former self. And as you get into the 15th century, it constitutes basically only the province of Granada. As you say, Cordoba is no longer part of it at the end. This is not to say, and I hope you will find this compelling when you read the book, that the province of Granada was not able to put up a very stout and serious defense against Ferdinand and Isabella, and one has to be in reading and writing about medieval history very careful about numbers. But the chronicles tell us that even at the end, the Islamic forces were able to mount 20 and 30,000 force defense. And on top of that, I think one of the reasons that it lasts as long as it does is because of the geography of the South, where you have the highest mountains in the country and where Granada itself is a formidable bastion. And there are other formidable bastions. And the Granada sits in this kind of bowl that is surrounded by very high mountains, which makes it easier to defend.
And indeed, you realize that what happened when the caliphate died in 1009, you had Spain fracture into the reinos de taifas, all these individual kingdoms, and then you could pick them off one by one by one. And it took a while.
Yes, my name is Edward Sauer. Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting presentation. I wanted to pick up not on Spanish history, but on the subject of history itself. I noticed Mr. Reston, right at the beginning of his remarks, made it clear that he was attempting to write something that was relevant for today, that was presently useful for today, not necessarily a work of scholarship so much as history as literature. And that intrigued me since, as I think about it, I'm sure many of the sources that you looked at were that sort of work of scholarship. People who were just trying to record what happened and make a contribution to historical literature. I guess my question is, to what extent do we need both? To what extent do we need to have a balance between those two? And how do you feel about working with those sources and trying to bring them into the 21st century?
Well, I don't see a conflict between scholarship and literature. It seems to me that one can practice both at the same time, that literature is not less for, or that, put it the opposite way, that scholarship cannot inform and infuse great historical literature. So, I mean, one doesn't have to write badly to be a scholar. I mean, it's not an absolute requirement. And certainly here in the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, I would want literature to be embraced in that thing. Of course, it is the scholarly works that is the grist for a work like this. Of course, I spent many days and weeks and months in the Hispanic Reading Room and elsewhere in the Library of Congress reading very scholarly and very wonderful scholarly works. I make no apology for the fact that I have attempted here what I call historical literature, but I want a wide readership. I want to bring this story to a big audience because it's a good story, because it has something to teach us. And if you look at the review of the book in USA Today this morning, for example, it says that Reston's book is wonderful because it has no footnotes. So if that's a plus, then so be it. But I think it's a false distinction to say literature versus scholarship. I think they can embrace one another very happily.
We find a lot of it has to do with who you identify as your audience. And if your audience is a small group of specialists and you're writing for them, people get very precise and very highly qualified in their writing and don't seek for the more general phrasing. We try and urge people here to make the best scholarship available to the general reader. And that taxes people who are used to writing for very limited audiences. But it's a nice exercise, and we think it's worth the trip. And I think Jim is a very good exemplar of that. Everett?
When I started my career at the Library of Congress, my boss set me down and said, read these letters that were written in 1939. And there were letters in there of people writing in and saying, where is Mexico located? Is it north or south of the United States? Then what followed was a 3-page letter which said why you should study Mexican history, why you should get into this. And names started appearing in this correspondence that I was recognizing as deans, as presidents of universities, as scholars in the field. Who's to say that somebody's going to take this book, like it, and say, gee, I'm going to write a history of Malaga?
That would be welcome. Well, please join me in thanking our panel for a very nice presentation. And join us across the hall for a reception, please. Well done.
One of my college roommates,
If we can ever figure out when Book TV will show this, well, see what it looks like.
Leinenkirk out? No, I have not. No, I have not.
You have to just check their website.